What happens when one of Hollywood's most iconic voices meets poetry scrawled on cardboard? Morgan Freeman was simply walking through New York after a film screening when he noticed something unusual: a homeless man hunched over makeshift paper, writing intensely rather than asking for money. While millions recognized Freeman's voice from blockbuster films, no one had heard Arthur Sinclair's words in years. Once a respected professor and published poet, Sinclair had disappeared into homelessness after personal tragedy. When Freeman began reading the homeless poet's words aloud, strangers stopped in their tracks. A young filmmaker captured the moment, and within hours the video exploded across the internet. But no one expected what happened next. A daughter who thought her father was dead, a publisher who remembered a brilliant voice silenced too soon, and a profound second chance that would transform countless lives beyond the sidewalk where they met. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening air carried a hint of autumn as Morgan Freeman walked along the edge of Central Park. He'd slipped away from a film screening after party, trading the clamor of celebration for the gentle symphony of a New York night. His collar turned up against the cool breeze, he moved with unhurried grace, a solitary figure whose presence somehow filled the entire sidewalk. Morgan paused at the intersection, waiting for the light to change. 40 years in the industry, and still, there were moments when he needed to step away and remember why stories mattered. Tonight was one of those nights. The film had been well received, another character brought to life, another narrative shared with the world. But something felt incomplete. Stories give shape to our lives, he murmured to himself, his distinctive baritone barely audible above the city's persistent hum. But whose stories are we missing? The light changed, and Morgan crossed, his eyes scanning the urban landscape. The familiar mixture of beauty and hardship that defined New York City spread before him. Sleek towers of glass and steel rising above weathered brownstones, fashionable pedestrians striding past those who had nowhere else to go. It was one of these figures that caught Morgan's attention. An elderly man sat against the wall of a closed cafe, but unlike the other homeless individuals Morgan had passed, this man wasn't asking for money. Instead, he hunched over a large piece of cardboard, writing intently with a stubby pencil. Beside him lay several more cardboard pieces, each covered in neat, cramped handwriting. Something about the man's focused determination drew Morgan closer. The homeless man, thin but dignified, with a salt and pepper beard and weathered hands, didn't look up as Morgan approached. He simply continued writing, his pencil moving across the cardboard with surprising fluidity. Morgan stood quietly, not wanting to disturb the man's concentration. From this angle, he could make out some of the words. The city wears two faces, one of light and one of shadow. I have lived in both, breathed both, known both as home. Each morning the sun baptizes steel and stone anew, while I remain, unchanged, a footnote to its glory. That's beautiful, Morgan said softly. The man looked up, startled. His eyes, clear blue and surprisingly sharp, assessed Morgan with neither recognition nor particular interest. Just passing the time, he replied, his voice cultured despite its rough edges. He returned to his writing. Morgan knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the seated poet. May I? He asked, gesturing to one of the completed cardboard sheets. The man shrugged. Help yourself, not like I'm selling them. Morgan picked up the nearest piece. The writing covered both sides, flowing across the corrugated surface as if the cardboard were the finest parchment. He began to read, not silently but aloud, his resonant voice giving new life to the words. They ask why I don't seek shelter, why I choose to face the night, as if walls and roofs could shelter what's been hollowed from inside. I've had mansions made of promises and castles built of dreams, but words, these words, are the only home I have left. Morgan felt his throat tighten as he continued reading. The poetry wasn't polished or perfect, but it carried a raw truth that reached inside and twisted something deep in his chest. He read on. unaware that his voice had drawn the attention of passers-by. I am not the man you pity, though my hands are cracked and sore. I am not the ghost you fear to see reflected in your glass. I am simply one who stumbled when the path grew dark and steep and now watches as you hurry toward horizons I once chased. As Morgan read the final lines of the poem, he became aware of the small crowd that had gathered. Some had stopped out of curiosity, others because they recognized him, but all stayed for the words, the unexpected poetry flowing from a piece of discarded cardboard, carried on the voice of a man they knew from screens both large and small. Among them stood Jacob Reynolds, his delivery backpack still slung over his shoulder, forgotten as he raised his phone to capture the moment. The young filmmaker had been on his way to his last food delivery of the night when Morgan Freeman's unmistakable voice had stopped him in his tracks. Now he filmed with growing excitement, his instincts telling him he was witnessing something extraordinary. Morgan finished reading and looked up at the gathered faces, momentarily surprised by his audience. Then he turned back to the poet. "Did you write this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The man nodded once, uncomfortable with the attention. "Name's Arthur. Most people call me Artie." He glanced nervously at the growing crowd. "Look, I'm not trying to cause a scene." "You're not causing anything," Morgan assured him. "Your words are just reaching people." A woman in the crowd called out, "Read another one." Morgan looked questioningly at Artie, who hesitated, then selected another cardboard sheet from his small collection and handed it over with reluctance. "If you're going to do it anyway," he muttered. Morgan accepted the piece with a nod of thanks. As he began to read again, his voice gathered strength, infusing Artie's words with dignity and power. This poem spoke of lost love, of a woman whose memory was both comfort and torment, whose absence had left a void that no achievement could fill. Jacob moved carefully through the crowd, capturing not just Morgan's reading, but the reactions of the listeners, their surprised glances, their growing attention, the way some wiped surreptitiously at their eyes. But most of all, he focused on Artie's face, the mixture of pride and pain, vulnerability, and guarded hope. When Morgan finished the second poem, the crowd had doubled in size. Someone started to clap and others joined in. Morgan turned to Artie, whose expression had shifted from discomfort to disbelief. "Your words deserve to be heard," Morgan told him quietly, as the applause continued. Artie looked away. "Words are cheap. They don't keep you warm or fed." "On the contrary," Morgan replied. "The right words in the right voice, they can change everything." He paused. "May I ask how long you've been writing?" "All my life," Artie answered simply. Then, with a hint of defiance, "Being homeless doesn't mean being thoughtless." Morgan nodded, a new respect in his eyes. "Clearly not." He hesitated, sensing Artie's pride but feeling compelled to help. "Would you allow me to buy these from you? As a collector, I mean." Artie's expression closed. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity to pay for something of value," Morgan countered. "And these have value." Before Artie could respond, a young woman approached and placed a $20 bill in the coffee cup by his side. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your poem about the woman, it made me call my mother for the first time in months." Others followed, her example dropping money into the cup or simply thanking Artie. The elderly poet seemed overwhelmed, unsure how to respond to this sudden outpouring. Jacob, still filming, captured the moment when Morgan placed a hand on Artie's shoulder, a gesture both reassuring and respectful. He caught Morgan slipping what looked like a business card into Artie's pocket with a whispered word, and he kept filming as the crowd finally began to disperse, leaving Artie staring at the now-filled cup with an expression of bewildered gratitude. "I don't understand," Artie said, looking up at Morgan. "They're just words." Morgan smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. "There's no such thing as just words, Mr. Sinclair. Words build worlds. They tear them down. They heal and wound and remember." He gestured to the cardboard poems. "These aren't just words, they're your truth." Artie shook his head slightly, unwilling or unable to accept this assessment. Truth doesn't pay the bills. Perhaps not directly, Morgan acknowledged, but it connects us. And sometimes that's where everything begins. As Morgan finally took his leave, promising to return, Jacob lingered, gathering the courage to approach Artie. The older man had already begun writing again, as if trying to process the evening's events through the only medium he truly trusted. "Excuse me, sir?" Jacob said, shifting his weight nervously. "I'm Jacob. I'm a filmmaker, well, trying to be. I caught what just happened on video. Would it be okay if I used it? I think people should hear your poetry." Artie glanced up, studying Jacob's earnest face. What difference would it make? Jacob thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "I don't know. But I'd like to find out." With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, Artie nodded. "Once. Do what you want. Words are meant to be free anyway." Later that night, after delivering his last order and returning to his cramped apartment, Jacob uploaded the video. He edited it minimally, letting the power of the moment speak for itself. Morgan Freeman, the voice of God in so many films, giving voice to an invisible man's soul. As the upload completed, Jacob hesitated over the title. Finally, he typed, "The Poet's Voice, Morgan Freeman reads homeless man's poetry." "Sometimes," he murmured to himself, echoing Morgan's words from earlier, "that's where everything begins." The video would gather only a handful of views before Jacob went to sleep. But algorithms work in mysterious ways, and by morning, Artie's words, carried on Morgan Freeman's voice, would begin their journey across the digital landscape, reaching ears and hearts neither man had ever imagined. Jacob's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. He fumbled for it in the darkness of his apartment, squinting at the screen as notifications cascaded one after another. Comments, shares, messages from strangers. The brightness of the display illuminated his bewildered expression as the numbers climbed higher by the second. 1,000 views. 100,000 views. 243,000 views. "What the hell?" he muttered, sitting up in bed. He'd uploaded videos before. Short films, scenes from his neighborhood, moments he thought deserved preservation. But nothing had ever gained traction like this. He tapped on the notification and stared at the comment section, now flooding with reactions. This moved me to tears. Who is this poet? Morgan Freeman could read a grocery list and I'd listen, but these words, anyone know where to find this man? His work deserves to be published. Jacob scrolled through the comments, a slow smile spreading across his face. By the time he'd showered and dressed, the view count had crossed the 1,000,000 mark. News sites were already reaching out, requesting permission to share the video. His phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Hello? Is this Jacob Reynolds?" The voice was professional, focused. "Yes, speaking. This is Eliza Chen from Morning America. We'd like to talk to you about your viral video." Artie woke to the same slice of sky he'd seen for the past 3 years. A narrow band of blue between two buildings where morning light spilled into the alleyway he'd claimed as his temporary shelter. He rolled his stiff shoulders and reached for his cardboard collection, counting the pieces as he did every morning. A ritual of reassurance. The previous night felt like a dream. Morgan Freeman, the actual Morgan Freeman, reading his poetry aloud to a crowd of strangers. People actually listening, some even moved by his words. The coffee cup full of money that he'd carefully hidden before settling down to sleep. It hadn't been charity, he told himself. They'd paid for his words, not out of pity. There was dignity in that. Artie emerged from the alley, his few possessions packed away in a weathered backpack. The coffee cup's contents would mean a proper breakfast this morning, his first in weeks, and perhaps new pencils. As he walked toward the small diner he frequented when funds allowed, he noticed something odd. People were looking at him, not with the usual averted gazes or uncomfortable pity, but with recognition. A young man nudged his friend and pointed. A woman smiled warmly as she passed. At the diner's counter, the waitress, Linda, according to her name tag, set down a mug of coffee he hadn't ordered yet. On the house, she said with a wide smile. My daughter showed me the video this morning. Your poem about the woman waiting by the window reminded me of my mother. Artie stared at the steaming mug. What video? Before Linda could answer, the bell above the door jingled and a middle-aged man in a business suit approached, setting a $10 bill on the counter. For your breakfast, he said to Artie. That poem about the city's two faces? I've lived here 30 years and never could have put it so well. Bewildered, Artie looked from the man to Linda. I don't understand. What's happening? Linda pulled out her phone and turned it toward him. You're happening, honey, all over the internet. The screen showed Morgan Freeman kneeling beside him, reading from one of his cardboard sheets. The view count at the bottom of the video had reached 2.3 million. Artie felt the floor tilt beneath him. His words, his private thoughts scribbled on discarded cardboard, were being heard by millions. The very idea was so alien he could barely process it. Are you all right? Linda asked, concerned by his pallor. I need some air, he managed, rising unsteadily from the stool. Outside was no better. 3 teenagers asked for a selfie, which he refused with a mumbled apology. A woman pressed a 20 into his hand before he could object. By the time Artie reached his usual spot near the park, a small crowd had already gathered, waiting. He turned and walked the other way, his heart hammering in his chest. Vanessa Sinclair was running late for her shift at the hospital when her phone chimed with a message from her roommate. OMG, Vanessa. Is this your dad? The poet guy with Morgan Freeman? A video link followed. Vanessa hesitated, her finger hovering over it. She'd long ago stopped searching for news of her father, tired of the disappointment, the dead ends, the unanswered questions. 5 years since their last contact. 8 since her mother's death had sent him spiraling into a depression that eventually swallowed him whole. She clicked the link. The subway car around her faded into background noise as she watched Morgan Freeman's voice bring her father's words to life. Arthur Sinclair, once a respected literature professor, published poet, and her hero, sat on the sidewalk, thin and weathered but unmistakably alive. A sob escaped her before she could catch it, drawing glances from other passengers. Her father wasn't dead. He wasn't missing in the absolute sense. He was in New York, the same city where she'd moved for medical school, writing poetry on cardboard. The train stopped. She needed to exit for work where patients were waiting. Instead, she remained seated, watching the video a second time, then a third. Her fingers trembled as she texted her supervisor. Family emergency. Need the day off. Will explain later. His words on the cardboard haunted her. Words about a woman, her mother, whose absence had left him hollow. Words about falling when the path grew steep. She'd always believed he'd simply abandoned her when life became too difficult. Now, listening to his poetry, she wondered if there was more to the story than she'd allowed herself to see. But even as sympathy stirred, so did anger. If he could write like this, if he still had this voice inside him, why had he disappeared? Why had he left her to mourn him as if he were dead? In his Upper East Side apartment, Charlie Whitman watched the viral video for the 5th time, pausing occasionally to jot notes in the leather-bound journal he'd carried since his early days in publishing. At 73, Charlie had seen the industry transform, had watched as spreadsheets replaced editorial intuition, as algorithms determined literary value. He'd retired early, or escaped, as he put it to friends, preserving his reputation, but leaving behind the work that had once defined him. This homeless poet, though, there was something in his words that resonated with a time when poetry mattered, when literature wasn't just content but conscience. Charlie reached for his phone, hesitated, then dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Marianne. It's Charlie. Whitman. Yes, the very same. Listen, I need a favor. There's a poet I want to track down. Morgan Freeman's driver pulled up to the curb where he'd encountered Artie the previous evening. Morgan scanned the area, concerned when he didn't see the poet in his usual spot. The business card he'd left with his personal number, not his publicist's, hadn't resulted in a call, which didn't surprise him. Men like Artie had learned that offers of help often came with invisible strings. He'd seen the viral video that morning, courtesy of a text from his agent. "Morgan, what exactly are you up to now?" Followed by the link. He'd watched it with mixed emotions, pride in having amplified Artie's powerful words, but concern about the unexpected exposure. Fame, even fleeting internet fame, could be destabilizing for anyone, let alone a man already living on the margins. Morgan approached a hot dog vendor who appeared to be a fixture of the block. "Excuse me, I'm looking for the gentleman who usually sits over there." "Older man, writes poetry?" The vendor nodded in recognition. "Artie?" "Yeah, he was here earlier but took off when people started showing up looking for him. Never seen him move so fast." He pointed down the street. "Might have headed toward the library. He spends time there when the weather's bad." Morgan thanked him and continued his search, eventually finding Artie in a quiet corner of the public library, hunched over a computer terminal. The contrast was striking. A man without a home, navigating the digital world where his words were suddenly spreading like wildfire. "Mr. Sinclair," Morgan said softly, approaching with deliberate steps to avoid startling him. Artie looked up, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. "Mr. Freeman, I suppose I should thank you for last night, but..." He gestured at the screen, which showed Jacob's video. "I'm not entirely sure what you've unleashed." Morgan pulled up a chair, careful to give Artie space. "Neither am I," he admitted. "But your words deserve to be heard, did they?" Artie's voice held no bitterness, only genuine uncertainty. "I wrote them for myself, to make sense of things, to remember who I was." "And who were you?" Morgan asked gently. Artie's gaze drifted to the middle distance. "A professor, once. At Columbia, literature and poetry, had books published, had a family." His voice caught. "Had a life." "What happened?" "Life happened," Artie replied simply. "My wife died. Cancer. I couldn't cope. Started drinking. Lost my position. Lost my home. Lost my daughter's respect." He refocused on Morgan. "The usual story, nothing special." "Your poetry suggests otherwise," Morgan countered. "There's nothing usual about your voice, Artie." Artie closed the browser window, shutting down the video, mid-play. "Voice doesn't matter much when you have nowhere to speak from." He hesitated, then added, "People are looking for me, following me, expecting things." "What are they expecting?" "More poetry. More wisdom. As if living on the streets has made me some kind of urban prophet." He shook his head. "They've created a story around me that isn't true." Morgan considered this. "Then tell your own story, the real one." Before Artie could respond, a librarian approached. "Professor Sinclair?" she said tentatively. Artie stiffened at the use of his former title. "There's a call for you at the desk." "A Mr. Whitman?" "He says it's about your poetry." Artie's expression shifted from surprise to something like fear. "Charlie Whitman from Atlantic Press?" The librarian nodded. "He says he saw the video and recognized your name. He was quite insistent." Morgan watched understanding dawn on Artie's face, the realization that his past and present were colliding in ways he couldn't control. "You know this person?" he asked. "He published my first collection, 20 years ago." Artie's hands trembled, slightly. I didn't expect anyone from that life to find me here." "You don't have to take the call," Morgan reminded him. Artie stood slowly. "Yes, I do. Some ghosts you have to face eventually." He paused. Would you mind coming with me?" Morgan nodded, recognizing the request for what it was. Not just company, but a silent affirmation that whatever happened next, Artie wouldn't face it alone. In a small Brooklyn apartment, Jacob stared at his laptop screen in disbelief. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. A homeless poet and Morgan Freeman were trending. His inbox overflowed with messages, interview requests, inquiries about Artie, even offers to represent him as an agent would. The video had tapped into something powerful, a hunger for authenticity, for unexpected beauty in overlooked places. for a voice that spoke truth without filters or agendas. His phone rang again. Another journalist. Another request. But as the day progressed, Jacob found himself less interested in his own sudden visibility and more concerned with what came next. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a man's life, suddenly exposed. A story still unfolding. He reached for his camera equipment. There was more to document, more to understand. This was no longer about a chance encounter captured on film, but about what happened when a forgotten voice suddenly found an audience. As the late afternoon light slanted through his window, Jacob made a decision. He would find Artie again, not for another viral video, but to offer what he could, a way to tell the complete story on Artie's own terms. He picked up his camera and headed for the door, unaware that across the city, others were already converging around the poet whose words had, in the space of 24 hours, traveled from a piece of cardboard to the collective consciousness of millions. Vanessa sat in a coffee shop across from the library, watching the entrance. She'd spent the morning tracking her father's movements through the comment section of the viral video, where eager fans reported sightings. Just saw the poet guy near Bryant Park. OMG, the homeless poet is at the public library on 42nd. The digital breadcrumbs had led her here, to this moment of decision. She had so many questions, so much anger, so much unresolved grief. But beneath it all lay a simpler truth. He was her father, and whatever had happened between them, she needed to see him with her own eyes. Through the library's glass doors, she caught a glimpse of a familiar profile. Older, more weathered, but unmistakable. Her father, walking beside Morgan Freeman toward the reception desk. Her heart stuttered. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Vanessa raised her coffee cup with shaking hands, buying herself a few more moments before the reunion she'd both longed for and dreaded for 5 long years. Artie's hand trembled as he held the library phone. Behind him, Morgan Freeman stood quietly, a steadying presence in a world that suddenly felt like quicksand beneath Artie's feet. "Arthur Sinclair," came the gruff voice on the line. "I'd recognize those words anywhere, homeless or not." "Charlie," Artie acknowledged, his voice catching. "It's been a long time. Too damn long. I watched that video this morning and nearly spilled my coffee. The great Professor Sinclair, writing poetry on cardboard." There was no mockery in Charlie's tone, only a strange mix of wonder and sadness. "You disappeared on us, Arthur, on the whole literary world." Artie closed his eyes. "I had my reasons. I'm sure you did, and I'm not calling to drag them out of you." A pause. "I'm calling because those words on that cardboard, they're the best damn thing I've read in years." The compliment landed like a physical weight on Artie's shoulders. "They're just thoughts, fragments. They're poetry, Arthur, real poetry. The kind this world's forgotten how to write, how to hear." Charlie's voice softened. "I want to publish them." Artie's grip tightened on the phone. "I don't write books anymore, Charlie." "Evidently you do, just on different material." "I'm not, the same man you knew." "Thank God for that," Charlie retorted. "The man I knew was brilliant but safe. These words, they've been forged in something real." Artie glanced back at Morgan, who nodded encouragingly. "I don't even have copies of what I've written," Artie said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Most of it's been thrown away or ruined by rain. Then we'll start fresh, a new collection." "I don't have an address, Charlie. I don't have a bank account. I don't have details," Charlie interrupted. "All fixable. The question is, do you still have the courage to be heard?" The question hung between them, spanning years of silence and loss. Artie struggled to find an answer that didn't feel like a lie. "I need to think about it," he finally said. Charlie sighed. "Fair enough. I'm at the Marcus Hotel until Friday, room 1542. He paused. "I mean it, Arthur. The world needs your voice now more than ever. Don't disappear on us again." The line went dead. Artie replaced the receiver and turned to Morgan, who had maintained a respectful distance throughout the conversation. "He wants to publish my work," Artie said, the words sounding surreal even as he spoke them. Morgan nodded. That's wonderful. Is it? Artie ran a hand through his gray hair. I'm not sure I'm ready to be visible again. Why not? Artie gestured vaguely at himself. The worn clothes, the weathered face, the physical manifestation of his downfall. I've been invisible for a reason. It's safer that way. Safer for whom? Morgan asked gently. Before Artie could answer, a young man approached them, camera in hand. Jacob Reynolds, looking simultaneously apologetic and determined. Mr. Sinclair? Mr. Freeman, I'm Jacob, the one who posted the video. He shifted nervously. I wanted to apologize if I've caused any trouble. Artie studied the young filmmaker. You've certainly caused something. I know, and I'm sorry if it was unwelcome, but I also wanted to say. Jacob hesitated. I think there's more to this story. Your story. If you'd be willing, I'd like to document it. Not just for views or anything like that, but because I think it matters. Morgan watched Artie carefully, seeing the conflict play across the older man's face, the instinct to retreat battling against something else. Something like hope. Why would anyone care about my story? Artie asked, but there was genuine curiosity beneath the skepticism. Because it's about falling and surviving. Jacob replied simply. About finding your voice again when the world has forgotten you exist. That's something everyone fears, isn't it? Morgan stepped forward. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere. More comfortable? I imagine the library isn't the ideal place for this conversation. 10 minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner of a nearby cafe. The owner, recognizing Morgan, had ushered them to a private table away from windows and curious eyes. Jacob had respectfully set his camera aside, focusing instead on building trust. This publisher who called, Jacob said, he's offering you a way back in? Artie nodded, turning his coffee cup in slow circles, back into a world I left a long time ago, a world I'm not sure wants me anymore. The response to your poetry suggests otherwise, Morgan observed. Artie shook his head. People are responding to novelty. The contrast. Academy Award-winning actor reads homeless man's scribbles. It's a momentary fascination. I disagree, Jacob said with surprising firmness. I've been reading the comments. People are connecting with your words, not just the circumstance. The boy's right, Morgan added. They're hearing something authentic in your voice, something rare. Artie looked away, uncomfortable with their conviction. I appreciate what you're both trying to do, but you don't understand what it means to step back into the light after living in shadow for so long. Morgan leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. May I tell you a story, Artie? Isn't that what you do? A small smile softened Artie's words. This one's personal. Morgan settled back, his resonant voice dropping to a more intimate register. When I was a young actor, I had a chance at a significant role, career-making potentially, but at the last moment, I nearly backed out. Do you know why? Artie shook his head. Because I was afraid my voice wasn't right. Not deep enough, not commanding enough. I'd been teased about my voice as a child, you see. Worked for years to deepen it, control it. But standing on the precipice of real visibility, those old doubts came rushing back. Morgan's gaze held Artie's. I convinced myself it was safer to remain in smaller roles, less visible, less vulnerable to criticism. Jacob listened, camera forgotten, absorbed in a story he suspected few had heard. What changed your mind? Artie asked. An old theater director took me aside. He told me, Morgan, that voice you're hiding, it's not a liability. It's the truest thing about you. The world doesn't need another actor with a perfect voice. It needs your voice with all its distinctive qualities. Morgan smiled at the memory. He said, the very thing you think will keep you from success is actually the only thing that will make your success meaningful. The parallels weren't lost on Artie. He stared into his coffee, absorbing Morgan's words. Your poetry, Artie, Morgan continued, carries the weight of your journey. The streets, the loss, the struggle, they've shaped your voice into something powerful, something necessary. Artie looked up, vulnerability and doubt warring in his expression. And what if I step back into that world and fail again? What if I disappoint everyone? What if I'm not the poet they think I am? Then you'll have tried, Morgan said simply, which is more than most people ever do. A contemplative silence settled over the table, broken only when Jacob spoke. Mr. Sinclair, whatever you decide about the publishing offer, would you allow me to continue documenting this journey? No pressure, no expectations, just bearing witness. Artie studied the young filmmaker, seeing earnest integrity behind the ambition. Slowly he nodded. On one condition. You show the truth, whatever that turns out to be. No fairy tales. I promise, Jacob replied solemnly. Morgan checked his watch. I have an engagement this evening, but I'd like to help however I can, Artie. Perhaps we could meet again tomorrow? As they prepared to part ways, Morgan pulled Jacob aside. Take care with his story, he said quietly. There's more fragility there than he shows. Jacob nodded, understanding the responsibility he'd been given. Vanessa Sinclair sat frozen in a back corner of the cafe, a menu held strategically to shield her face. She'd followed her father, Morgan Freeman, and the young filmmaker from the library, always maintaining a careful distance. Now, she found herself inadvertently eavesdropping on their conversation, hearing pieces of her father's struggle that she'd never considered. He's afraid, she realized with a jolt, as afraid as I am. As the men rose to leave, Vanessa ducked her head, holding her breath until they passed. She watched through the window as they parted ways on the sidewalk, her father walking alone in one direction, Morgan Freeman sliding into a waiting car and the filmmaker hailing a taxi. She should follow her father. Speak to him. End this painful dance of proximity without connection. Instead, she pulled out her phone and called the one person who might understand. Lisa? It's me. I found my dad. 20 minutes later, her best friend from medical school slid into the booth. Across from her, concern etched across her features. You actually saw him? Spoke to him? Vanessa shook her head. Just saw. I don't know what to say to him. Lisa reached across the table, squeezing Vanessa's hand. Start with hello? It's not that simple. Vanessa's voice cracked. 5 years, Lisa. 5 years of thinking he might be dead in a ditch somewhere, of checking morgue reports, of jumping every time my phone rang from an unknown number. The anger she'd suppressed earlier resurfaced. He was here, writing poetry, on cardboard while I mourned him. Did you hear anything about why he disappeared? Lisa asked gently. Vanessa recounted what she'd overheard, the publishing offer, her father's resistance, his fear of stepping back into the light. He didn't sound like the man who abandoned me, she admitted. He sounded broken. People break in different ways, Lisa said. Some lash out, some run away. That doesn't make it okay. No, it doesn't. But it might make it understandable. Vanessa stared out the window, watching pedestrians hurry past. I heard Morgan Freeman tell him that his suffering had made his poetry more powerful, that his voice matters more now, not less. She turned back to Lisa. What if that's true? What if falling apart made him a better poet? Does that change how you feel about him leaving you? I don't know. Vanessa's eyes welled with tears. That's what scares me. I've been angry for so long, it's become part of me. If I let that go, who am I? Lisa's expression softened. You're still you, just with one less burden to carry. As they talked, Vanessa's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. Everything okay? Need coverage for tomorrow too? Reality intruded, patients who needed her, responsibilities that couldn't be set aside for the emotional tumult she was experiencing. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was equally critical, a juncture that would determine the course of her life and her father's. I need more time, she said, half to herself, to figure out what to say, how to feel. Lisa nodded. Just don't wait too long. From what you've said, he's at a crossroads too. You might not get another chance like this. The weight of that possibility settled over Vanessa like a physical presence. 5 years of absence might stretch into a lifetime if she hesitated too long. Jacob worked through the night, reviewing his footage, organizing clips, building the skeleton of what could become a remarkable documentary. The material he'd captured already told a compelling story. Morgan Freeman's chance encounter with a homeless poet, the viral video that followed, the conflicted emotions as Artie faced sudden visibility. But it was the deeper narrative that captivated Jacob. The former professor's fall from grace, his retreat from the world, and now, this unexpected second chance. It was the story Jacob had always wanted to tell, one about human resilience and the redemptive power of art. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. It's Morgan Freeman. Met with Artie this evening. He's agreed to visit Charlie tomorrow. Could use your presence to document. 10 a.m. Marquee Hotel lobby. Jacob stared at the message, adrenaline surging through him. Artie had made his decision. The crossroads had been navigated. His documentary now had its pivotal moment. In a makeshift shelter behind the library, Artie sat on a bench beneath an overhang that protected him from the light rain. Around him, his few possessions were packed neatly in his weathered backpack, including the cardboard sheets of poetry that had unexpectedly changed his life. He pulled out the most recent piece, on which he'd written a new poem after leaving the cafe. Second chances come disguised as fear, as mountains too steep to climb. The voice that whispers, "Stay here, stay safe," is the same that keeps us imprisoned in time. I have lived 1,000 days in shadow, each one a penance for failures past. But what if the darkness was never punishment, but preparation for light? At last? He traced the words with his fingertip, feeling their truth in a way he hadn't before. Morgan's story had resonated deeply. The fear of one's own voice, the instinct to hide rather than risk rejection. For years, Artie had convinced himself that his fall was deserved, his obscurity a fitting end to a life half-lived. Poetry had been his way of processing that belief, of making peace with his exile from the world that had once celebrated him. But what if there was another interpretation? What if, as Morgan suggested, his journey had transformed his voice into something more authentic, more necessary? And what of Vanessa, his daughter whose absence had left the greatest void of all? If he stepped back into the light, would there be a chance, however small, of reconciliation? Or would it simply expose him to another, more personal rejection? The night deepened around him as Artie weighed possibilities against fears, hope against experience. By morning, as the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, he'd made his decision. He would meet with Charlie. He would allow Jacob to document whatever came next. He would risk visibility, vulnerability, potential failure, telling and preparing. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Not because he felt worthy of redemption, but because the alternative, remaining forever in shadow when light had been offered, suddenly seemed like the greater loss. Artie carefully placed his poetry in his backpack and stood, muscles protesting after a night spent on a hard bench. The city was just awakening, streets emptier than usual in these pre-dawn hours. He began walking toward the Marquee Hotel, each step carrying him closer to the person he used to be, and perhaps to the person he might yet become. The Marquee Hotel lobby gleamed with polished marble and subtle wealth. Artie stood just inside the entrance, acutely aware of the contrast between his worn clothing and the opulence surrounding him. Despite Morgan's insistence that he purchase new attire for the meeting, Artie had declined. If Charlie wanted to publish his words, he would face the reality of who Artie had become, not some dressed-up version of his former self. Jacob arrived first, camera discreetly at his side. He offered Artie a reassuring nod but maintained a respectful distance, understanding that his role was to observe, not intervene. Morgan appeared moments later, his presence drawing subtle glances from hotel staff and guests. He greeted Artie with a warm handshake. "You made it," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Still not sure it's the right decision." Artie admitted. Most important decisions feel that way. Morgan checked his watch. Shall we head up? Charlie's expecting us. At 10. As they waited for the elevator, Artie's gaze drifted to his reflection in the mirrored doors. The man looking back at him seemed both familiar and foreign. The same eyes, the same basic features, but weathered by years and hardship. Would Charlie see the professor he'd once known, or only the homeless poet he'd become? The elevator ascended smoothly to the 15th floor, where Charlie had arranged for them to meet in a private dining room rather than his suite. Another gesture of respect, giving Artie neutral ground for their discussion. Charlie Whitman stood. As they entered, a barrel-chested man in his 70s with a shock of white hair and penetrating eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. He'd aged since Artie had seen him last, but carried the years with the confidence of someone who had earned every line on his face. For a moment, neither spoke, each taking in the changes time had wrought on the other. Then, Charlie extended his hand. Arthur. Good to see you in the flesh. Artie shook his hand, feeling a surprising surge of emotion at the contact. Charlie, you're looking well. Retired life agrees with me. Charlie nodded to Morgan. Mr. Freeman, appreciate you bringing him. His gaze shifted to Jacob and the camera. This part of the arrangement? Jacob's documenting the journey, Morgan explained. With Artie's permission. Charlie considered this, then shrugged. Long as you don't mind me speaking plainly. Never been one for performing. Just be yourself, Jacob assured him. I'll stay out of the way. They settled around the table, where coffee and a light breakfast had been arranged. Charlie wasted no time on pleasantries. I've spent the morning rereading your old collections, he said, placing 2 books on the table. Just to remind myself of your voice then, compared to what I heard in that video. He tapped the cover of the first book. Temporal Distances, 1996. Good work. Technically impressive. Academic approval. He slid it aside and touched the second. Beneath Still Waters, 2002. After your wife got sick. More personal, more risk. The critics were divided, but I always thought it was your stronger work. Artie stared at the books, memories flooding back. The hours of crafting each line, the anticipation of reviews, the readings to rooms half filled with other academics. A life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And now, Charlie continued, these poems on cardboard. Raw, unfiltered, no concern for academic approval or critical consensus, just truth. Born of necessity, Artie said quietly. When you have nothing but words, they become more essential. Charlie nodded, leaning forward. That's exactly why I want to publish them, Arthur. Not as some curiosity or human interest story, but because they're necessary poems in a world drowning in artifice. Morgan watched the exchange silently, sensing that his role here was not to facilitate but to witness, to be the support Artie needed without directing the course of events. Charlie produced a simple folder and slid it across the table. A standard contract, nothing fancy. First collection with option for a second. Fair advance considering the buzz you've already generated. He paused. And an advance against royalties means you can get proper housing, whatever else you need. Artie opened the folder but didn't look at the specifics. What would you call it, the collection? I was thinking Cardboard Confessions, Charlie replied. Unless you have another title in mind. Artie considered, then shook his head. That captures it. The material and the content. Look, Charlie said, his gruff voice softening. I know this is a big step. Coming back after everything you've been through. But these words deserve to be preserved, Arthur. To be bound together, not scattered to the wind or thrown in some dumpster. Artie glanced at Morgan, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Then he looked to Jacob, whose camera quietly documented this moment of decision. With deliberate motion, Artie reached for the pen Charlie offered and signed the contract. Charlie broke into a rare smile. Welcome back to the literary world, Professor Sinclair. Just Artie now, he corrected gently. The professor is long gone. We'll see about that, Charlie muttered, tucking the signed contract away. Now, Let's talk logistics. We'll need to collect all your existing poems, organize them, perhaps create some new ones to round out the collection. I was thinking, a knock at the door interrupted him. A hotel staff member entered, looking slightly flustered. I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen. There's a young woman downstairs asking for Professor Sinclair. She's quite insistent. Says she's his daughter? The blood drained from Artie's face. Vanessa? He whispered, the name foreign on his lips after so many years unspoken. Morgan straightened in his chair. Would you like us to ask her to wait, Artie? Artie shook his head, rising unsteadily to his feet. No, I've kept her waiting long enough. The hotel's small garden courtyard offered privacy away from the busy lobby. Artie stood among carefully tended flowers, his back to the entrance, gathering himself for the moment he'd both longed for and dreaded for 5 years. Behind him, the door opened, soft footsteps on the stone path. A pause. Dad? Artie turned slowly, fearing what he might see in his daughter's eyes. Vanessa stood 10 feet away, frozen in place. At 32, she had grown fully into her mother's beauty. The same graceful features, the same direct gaze, but the tension in her jaw, the way she held herself slightly apart, that was new. Vanessa, he said, her name catching in his throat. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Vanessa stepped forward, narrowing the physical distance, while the emotional chasm between them remained vast. I saw the video, she said, her voice carefully controlled. You're all over the internet. Everyone's talking about the homeless poet and Morgan Freeman. Artie nodded, unsure how to respond. 5 years, she continued, emotion beginning to crack through her composure. 5 years without a word. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I'm sorry, he said, knowing the inadequacy of the words even as he spoke them. Sorry? Vanessa's voice rose slightly. I thought you were dead. I checked morgues, Dad. I called hospitals. I hired a private investigator who eventually told me to prepare for the worst. Tears welled in her eyes. And all this time you were here? In the same city? I couldn't face you, Artie admitted, the pain of it fresh in his voice. After your mother died, after I lost my position, my home, I couldn't bear for you to see what I'd become. So you just disappeared? You decided that was better than letting me help you? The hurt in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. I'm a doctor now. Did you know that? I finished medical school. Mom would have been at my graduation, but neither of you were there. Artie felt the full weight of her words. You became a doctor? That's wonderful, Vanessa. Don't. She held up a hand. Don't act proud now, you weren't there. From the doorway, Morgan and Jacob watched silently. Morgan had insisted they remain nearby in case Artie needed support, but far enough away to give father and daughter privacy for their reunion. Jacob's camera stayed off, recognizing that some moments were too sacred to capture. Artie moved to a stone bench and sat heavily, the emotional toll evident in his posture. After a moment's hesitation, Vanessa joined him, maintaining a careful distance. I was a coward, Artie said simply. After your mother died, something broke in me. The drinking started, then the depression. I couldn't write, couldn't teach, couldn't function. He looked down at his weathered hands. The university was patient at first, but eventually they had to let me go. I lost the house. Lost everything. You still had me, Vanessa said quietly. Artie nodded, a tear tracking down his cheek. And that's why I couldn't come to you. You were just starting your life, your career. The last thing you needed was a broken-down alcoholic father dragging you down. That wasn't your decision to make. No, he agreed. It wasn't. But in my state, I couldn't see that. I could only see that I'd failed. As a husband, a professor, a provider. The thought of failing you too. He shook his head. I convinced myself you were better off without me. Vanessa was silent for a long moment, absorbing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less pained. Do you know what today is? Artie frowned, searching his memory. It's Mom's birthday, Vanessa said. March 18th. I took a personal day from the hospital. I visit her grave every year on her birthday. Shame washed over Artie. He'd lost track of dates long ago, the days blurring together in survival mode. That he'd forgotten his wife's birthday felt like another failure to add to the mounting list. She loved your poetry, Vanessa continued. When I was little, she would read it to me at bedtime. Did you know that? Not children's books, but your words. She believed in your voice so much. Her composure cracked further. And then she was gone, and you were gone. And all I had left were those books you wrote. Artie reached out tentatively, his hand stopping, short of touching hers. I never stopped thinking about you, Vanessa. Every day, every single day. But you never reached out. The longer I stayed away, the harder it became to imagine coming back, he admitted. What would I say? How could I explain? And then years had passed, and I assumed you'd moved on. That you'd be better off without the reminder of what I'd become. Jacob, watching from a distance, was struck by the painful parallel. Artie had hidden from his art and his daughter for the same reason: shame. The fear that neither would accept what he had become. Vanessa wiped at her eyes, visibly struggling with conflicting emotions. I saw you signing something upstairs, with that publisher. Artie nodded. A book contract. For the poems I've been writing, on the streets. So you're going to publish again after all this time? It seems so. Because Morgan Freeman read your poetry. There was a hint of bitterness in her question. Artie shook his head. Because, for the first time in years, I was forced to hear my own words through someone else's voice, to recognize that they might have value. He paused. I've been writing all along, Vanessa, but I never believed anyone should hear it again, least of all you. Why me? Because you knew who I was before, what I was capable of. The fall would seem that much greater. Vanessa stood suddenly, pacing a few steps away. When she turned back, her expression had hardened into resolve. I need to know something, and I need you to be completely honest. She took a deep breath. Were you drinking all this time? Is that why you stayed away? Artie understood the real question behind her words. As a doctor, as the daughter of a man who'd spiraled into alcoholism, she needed to know if his absence had been a prolonged bender, a choice of addiction over family. No, he said firmly. After the first year on the streets, I stopped. Cold, nearly died from the withdrawal. He met her gaze steadily. I've been sober for over 4 years. That's not why I stayed away. Relief flickered across Vanessa's features, quickly replaced by confusion. Then why? If you were sober, if you were writing again, why not come back? Because sobriety didn't restore what I'd lost. It just allowed me to see clearly how much damage I'd done. Artie's voice dropped lower. I didn't stay away because I was drunk, Vanessa. I stayed away because I was ashamed. The raw honesty of his answer hung in the air between them. Vanessa returned to the bench, sitting closer this time. I used to dream about finding you, she confessed. Every time I passed a homeless person, I'd look twice, wondering if it was you. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd convince you to come home. Her voice caught. But now that you're here, all those practiced words are gone. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Artie said. I know that. It's not about deserving, Vanessa replied, surprising him. It's about where we go from here. From the doorway, Morgan sensed a shift in the conversation, from painful past to uncertain future. He caught Jacob's eye, silently communicating that they should give father and daughter true privacy now. Jacob nodded, and they retreated inside. Alone in the courtyard, Artie and Vanessa sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the weight of their exchange. I have your books, Vanessa finally said. All of them. Even that limited chapbook from before I was born. A ghost of a smile touched Artie's lips. Your mother didn't even like that one. No, she said it was pretentious. The shared memory created a momentary bridge between them. But she kept it anyway. She kept everything you wrote. She was always my most faithful reader, Artie remembered, even when the critics weren't kind. What will happen now? Vanessa asked. With the book deal? Artie looked down at his hands. Charlie wants to publish a collection of what I've written on the streets. Cardboard confessions, he's calling it. And where will you live? You can't stay on the streets if you're publishing again. The question brought Artie up short. In the whirlwind of recent events, he hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know, he admitted. Charlie mentioned an advance, but I haven't really considered. There's a halfway house connected to the hospital where I work, Vanessa said, her professional demeanor resurfacing. They help people transition from homelessness to independent living. They could, Vanessa. Artie interrupted gently. Are you offering to help me? She met his gaze directly. I'm a doctor. Helping people is what I do. The measured response revealed the boundary she was establishing. Professional assistance, not yet the emotional reconnection of father and daughter. Artie accepted this with a nod, understanding it was more than he deserved and perhaps all she could offer right now. Thank you, he said simply. Vanessa checked her watch. I should go. I still need to visit Mom's grave. She hesitated. Would you want to come with me? The invitation caught Artie by surprise. He hadn't visited his wife's grave since the funeral, another failure in a long line of them. The thought of facing her headstone, of acknowledging her absence and his own abandonment of their shared grief, terrified him. But he recognized the olive branch Vanessa was extending. Tentative, fragile, but real. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible. Yes, I would. Vanessa nodded, standing. I'll meet you in the lobby in 10 minutes. I need to. She gestured vaguely, indicating she needed a moment to compose herself. As she walked toward the door, Artie called after her. Vanessa? She paused, looking back. I'm proud of you, he said, for becoming a doctor, for surviving what I put you through, for being strong enough to find me, even when I was too weak to find my way back to you. Vanessa's expression softened slightly. 10 minutes, Dad. After she disappeared inside, Artie remained on the bench, overwhelmed by the encounter. Their relationship wasn't restored, far from it. Years of absence couldn't be erased by one painful conversation. But it was a beginning, unexpected and undeserved. He pulled a folded piece of cardboard from his pocket and smoothed it open. During the previous sleepless night, he'd written a new poem, though he hadn't shown it to Charlie or Morgan. What right have I to step back into light when shadows were my choosing, not my fate? What words could justify these years of silence when those who loved me learned to live without? The hardest journey is not from wealth to want or from acclaim to anonymity's embrace. It's crossing back when pride has turned to shame, to face the eyes that once looked up in trust. The words felt inadequate now, in the wake of his daughter's tears. But as he tucked the poem away and stood to meet her, Artie realized that perhaps this, the insufficient, stumbling attempt to bridge what seemed unbridgeable, was the most honest poetry he had ever written. How did it go? Morgan asked quietly, as Artie re-entered the hotel. She's taking me to her mother's grave, Artie replied, emotion thick in his voice. It's Beth's birthday today. Morgan nodded, understanding the significance. Do you want us to come along? No. Artie's refusal was gentle but firm. This is something I need to do with my daughter. Just us. Of course. Morgan placed a hand on Artie's shoulder. Take all the time you need. Charlie and I can discuss the publishing details later. Thank you, Morgan. Artie's gratitude encompassed more than just this moment of understanding. For everything. I only read your words, Artie. You wrote them. Artie shook his head. You saw me when I'd forgotten how to be seen. That's a greater gift than you know. Jacob approached, respectfully keeping his camera lowered. Mr. Sinclair, would you like me to continue filming today, or would you prefer some privacy? Artie considered the question thoughtfully. The cemetery is off limits, he said. Some moments shouldn't be documented, but after, I think I'd like you to keep recording. He glanced toward the lobby where Vanessa would soon meet him. Whatever happens next, whether I succeed or fail at rebuilding what I broke, it's part of the story. Your film should show that too. Jacob nodded solemnly, understanding both the boundary and the trust being extended. As Artie moved toward the lobby to wait for Vanessa, Morgan and Charlie exchanged a glance that acknowledged the weight of what they'd witnessed, not just a literary comeback, but a man confronting the consequences of his choices, the damage caused by his absence, and the terrifying possibility of redemption. Think he'll make it? Charlie murmured to Morgan. Morgan watched Artie's solitary figure by the hotel entrance. I don't know, he admitted, but he's facing it. That's more than most people ever do. In the lobby, Artie stood straight-backed and still, preparing himself for what would surely be the most difficult pilgrimage of his life. Not the journey from professor to homeless poet, but the harder path back to being a father worthy of his daughter's forgiveness. The cemetery had been harder than Artie imagined. Standing before Beth's grave, the marble headstone he'd never seen before, the carefully tended plot that others had maintained in his absence, he'd found himself without words. The poet, silenced by grief and shame. Vanessa had stood beside him, not touching but present. She'd brought flowers, white lilies, her mother's favorite, and placed them gently against the stone. Then she'd stepped back, giving her father the space he needed to confront this moment. When Artie finally spoke, it was to the headstone, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry, Beth, for everything, for not being strong enough, for leaving her alone. His voice broke. For forgetting who I was. Vanessa had remained silent, tears tracking silently down her cheeks as she watched her father kneel before her mother's grave. A man confronting the wreckage of a life once filled with promise. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now, as April gave way to May, Artie sat in Charlie's office surrounded by proof sheets for cardboard confessions. The collection had come together with remarkable speed, partly due to Charlie's determination, partly because Artie's story had created anticipation in the literary world that the publisher was eager to satisfy. We're looking at a June release, Charlie said, flipping through the mock-up of the book. Advance orders are strong, very strong. Artie nodded, still somewhat dazed by the pace of events. He'd moved from the streets to a small studio apartment that Charlie had helped secure with his advance. The space was sparse but clean, a world away from the makeshift shelters and alleyways he'd called home for years. The cover design is stunning, Charlie continued, sliding the mock-up across the desk. Artie studied it, a photograph of actual cardboard, worn and weathered, with the title handwritten in what appeared to be his own script. How did you get my handwriting? Charlie smiled. Jacob provided it, from one of your original poems. He leaned back in his chair. The documentary is shaping up too, I hear. Jacob's been very respectful, Artie acknowledged. He doesn't push, just witnesses. It'll bring more attention to the book. Is that what matters? Artie asked, not confrontationally but with genuine curiosity. Charlie's expression softened. You know me better than that, Arthur. What matters is that your voice is being heard. Again. The commercial success is just a welcome bonus. Artie ran his fingers over the cover design, seeing his words transformed into a bound volume, tangible, permanent, valued, created a strange mixture of pride and unease. For years, he'd written with no audience in mind beyond himself and the occasional passerby. Now, strangers would hold his pain, his reflections, his journey in their hands. What if they don't understand it, he asked. The context, the experience behind the words? Some won't, Charlie admitted, but others will find their own meaning in it. That's the beauty of poetry, isn't it? It creates a bridge between experiences, yours and theirs. Artie nodded, remembering how he'd once explained this very concept to his students at Columbia, how poetry's greatest power lay in its ability to make the specific universal, to transform individual suffering into shared human experience. The foreword came in yesterday, Charlie added, pulling a printed page from a folder. From Morgan Freeman. Want to hear it? Artie hesitated, then nodded. Charlie began to read aloud, his gruff voice a stark contrast to Morgan's resonant tones. There are voices we hear once and never forget. They resonate not just in our ears, but in the chambers of our hearts, where truth recognizes truth. Arthur Sinclair's poetry speaks with such a voice, honest, unflinching, and profound in its simplicity. I encountered Arthur on a New York sidewalk, where he sat writing poetry on pieces of discarded cardboard. There was no audience, no acclaim, no purpose beyond the essential act of capturing his truth. Yet in those humble materials, I recognized something our curated, filtered world desperately needs: authentic human expression, born not of ambition, but of necessity. The poems in this collection were not written for publication or praise. They were written because the poet could not write them. They emerged from the crucible of loss, failed dreams, and daily survival. They speak of shameless skies and indifferent streets, of invisibility and remembrance, of falling away and the possibility, however remote, of finding one's way back. In reading Arthur's work, we are reminded that poetry is not a luxury, but a vital means of processing what it means to be human, that voices matter, especially those we have trained ourselves not to hear, and that sometimes the greatest art emerges not from comfort, but from its absence. I am honored to introduce this remarkable collection to the world, not as a curiosity or human interest story, but as a significant literary achievement by a poet who never stopped writing, even when he thought no one was listening. Charlie looked up from the page. Powerful stuff. Artie sat in silence, absorbing Morgan's words, the generosity of spirit behind them, the genuine respect for his work, not as a novelty, but as art worthy of serious consideration. He didn't have to do this, Artie said finally. No, Charlie agreed. But he wanted to. He believes in your voice, Arthur. As do I. He restored the foreword to its folder. Which brings me to my next question. What are your thoughts about the book launch? Artie tensed visibly. I haven't been in a room full of literary people in a decade, Charlie. All the more reason to make a splash. Seeing Artie's discomfort, Charlie softened his approach. Nothing extravagant. Small bookstore in the village. Intimate setting. Just a reading and signing? I don't know if I'm ready for that level of visibility. The video already has 15 million views, Arthur. You're visible whether you stand at a podium or not. Charlie leaned forward. The question is whether you'll own that visibility or let others define it for you. The wisdom in those words struck Artie deeply. For years he'd hidden, allowing shame to define him. Even now, with the book nearly ready for release, part of him wanted to retreat, to let the words stand on their own without exposing himself to public scrutiny. But the journey of the past weeks had shown him the cost of hiding. The conversation with Vanessa at her mother's grave had made that painfully clear. Invisibility might feel like safety, but it was its own kind of prison. All right, he said finally. A small event, but on one condition. Name it. I want the proceeds from the first printing to go to homeless support organizations, the ones doing real work, not just warehousing people. Charlie nodded, unsurprised. Already in the contract if you'd read the fine print. 10% of all proceeds in perpetuity. He smiled slightly. I know you, Arthur. Some things don't change. As Artie left Charlie's office and stepped onto the busy New York street, he felt a strange dissonance. These same sidewalks that had been his home now felt foreign beneath his feet. He was neither the homeless poet nor the esteemed professor. He existed in some undefined space between worlds, belonging fully to neither. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another novelty of his new life. The text was from Jacob. Meeting Morgan for lunch at Angelo's. Join us? 20 minutes later, Artie slid into a booth at the small Italian restaurant where Morgan and Jacob were already seated. Morgan greeted him warmly while Jacob's camera sat inactive on the table, a silent acknowledgement that some moments were meant to be lived, not documented. Charlie showed me your foreword, Artie said after they'd ordered. I don't know how to, thank you. Morgan waved away the gratitude. Your words deserved recognition. I simply pointed others toward them. The foreword is beautiful, Jacob added. It'll frame the collection perfectly. Artie studied the young filmmaker, noting the dark circles under his eyes. You look exhausted. Jacob smiled ruefully. Been editing around the clock. The documentary's really coming together, though, your story, and it resonates with people. My story isn't over, Artie reminded him. The best ones never are, Morgan observed. They continue beyond the final page, the closing credits. Their conversation meandered through updates on the book's production, Jacob's progress with the documentary, and the unexpected ripple effects of Artie's sudden visibility. Homeless advocacy groups had reached out, universities had expressed interest in having him speak, and literary magazines were requesting new work. It's overwhelming, Artie admitted. A month ago I was invisible. Now everyone wants a piece of me. Success has its own challenges, Morgan said. The key is remembering why you write in the first place. I wrote because it was the only thing I had left, Artie said softly. The only way to make sense of what my life had become. And now? Artie considered the question. Now, I'm not sure yet. I'm still finding my footing. As they finished their meal, Jacob excused himself to take a call from his producer, leaving Artie and Morgan alone at the table. A comfortable silence settled between them before Morgan spoke again. Have you spoken with Vanessa since the cemetery? Artie nodded. We've had coffee twice. It's careful, delicate, but it's something. She's coming to terms with finding you again, Morgan observed. That takes time. She's invited me to see where she works, Artie said, unable to hide the pride in his voice. The hospital. She's a resident in emergency medicine. Will you go? Next week. Artie traced the condensation on his water glass. It feels strange seeing her in her element. Accomplished, confident, all without me. That's a testament to her strength, Morgan pointed out, and to what you and her mother instilled in her before. Everything changed. Artie accepted this with a thoughtful nod. She asked about the book launch, whether she should come. And you said? That it was entirely her choice. Artie met Morgan's gaze. I won't pressure her, Morgan. She needs to find her own way back to me if that's what she wants. Morgan nodded approvingly. You're learning to navigate this new relationship. Trying to, at least. As they prepared to leave, Morgan placed a hand on Artie's shoulder. I'm flying to Los Angeles tomorrow. New film project. I'm not sure if I'll be back in time for your book launch. Artie felt a surprising pang of loss. Morgan had become more than a chance encounter, more than a catalyst for change. He'd become a friend, a steady presence during the most tumultuous transformation of Artie's life. I understand, Artie said. You've done more than enough already. I've done very little, Morgan countered. You've done the hard work, facing your past, reconnecting with your daughter, embracing your voice again. I wouldn't be here without you. Morgan's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps, or perhaps you would have found another path back. The poems were always there, waiting to be heard. He squeezed Artie's shoulder gently. Your words matter, Artie. The world just needed to hear them. In the weeks that followed, Artie settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Mornings spent writing at a small desk by the window of his apartment. Afternoons with Charlie, finalizing details for the book release. Occasional coffees with Vanessa, rebuilding their relationship one careful conversation at a time. Jacob continued his documentary work, capturing Artie's transition with sensitivity and insight. The footage had evolved from a simple viral moment to a nuanced exploration of homelessness, art, family, and redemption. But it was the broader impact of Artie's story that surprised him most. The video had sparked conversations about homelessness that transcended the usual political divides. It had reminded people that behind every cardboard sign was a human being, with a history, a voice, a story untold. Local news stations ran features on invisible talent in their communities, homeless, musicians, artists, writers whose circumstances had obscured their gifts. A theater company in Brooklyn launched a program bringing performance workshops to shelters. A tech entrepreneur established a grant for creative projects by people experiencing homelessness. "You've started something," Jacob observed one afternoon, as they reviewed recent coverage. "Something important." Artie shook his head. "Morgan started it. I was just writing poems on cardboard." "But that's the point," Jacob insisted. "You kept writing, even when no one was reading. That's what people connect with. The persistence of creativity, even in the hardest circumstances." As the book launch approached, Artie found himself increasingly reflective. The poems collected in cardboard confessions represented a chapter of his life that was closing. The man who had written them, homeless, isolated, defined by loss, was giving way to someone new. Not the professor he'd once been, but not the street poet either. Someone in between, shaped by both experiences. The night before the launch, Artie received a package at his apartment. Inside was a beautiful fountain pen with a note in Morgan's distinctive handwriting. "For the words yet to come, sorry I can't. Be there tomorrow, but know that I'm with you in spirit. Your journey continues as does your voice. Write on, my friend. Morgan." Artie held the pen, feeling its perfect weight in his hand. A tool for the next chapter, whatever it might hold. That same evening, his phone chimed with a text from Vanessa. "I'll be there tomorrow. Front row. Proud of you, Dad." 7 simple words that meant everything. The bookstore was more crowded than Charlie had anticipated. What was planned as an intimate gathering had expanded, as word spread through literary circles. And social media. By the time Artie arrived, people were standing in the aisles between bookshelves, craning for a view of the small podium. He lingered in the back room, anxiety threatening to overwhelm him. It had been a decade since he'd done a public reading. Even before his downfall, he'd found them nerve-wracking. Now, with so much riding on this moment, the pressure was nearly unbearable. Charlie appeared in the doorway. "Packed house," he said with satisfaction. "Standing room only." "Wonderful," Artie muttered, straightening his tie for the 5th time. The new clothes still felt foreign on his body. The first suit he'd worn since losing his position at Columbia. Simple, dignified attire that Jacob had insisted on purchasing for him despite Artie's protests. "Your daughter's here," Charlie added. "Front row as promised." Artie nodded, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. "Charlie, what if I—" "Don't," Charlie interrupted firmly. "No catastrophizing. You've lived through the worst already, Arthur. This is the reward." Before Artie could respond, Jacob slipped into the room, camera in hand but not recording. "Just wanted to check in," he said. "You ready for this?" Artie managed a weak smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." Jacob studied him for a moment, then set his camera aside completely. "Can I share something? Off the record?" Artie nodded. "When I first filmed you and Morgan that night, I thought I was capturing something special. But I had no idea what would come after." Jacob's expression was earnest, his usual documentarian's distance replaced by genuine emotion. "Watching you these past weeks, reconnecting with your daughter, reclaiming your voice, helping others in the process, it's changed how I see my own work. What stories matter, what impact they can have. Your documentary has been part of that." "Impact," Artie reminded him. "Maybe," Jacob acknowledged, "but the story was always yours. I just helped make it visible." The parallels to Morgan's words weren't lost on Artie. Both men had served as amplifiers for his voice, each in their own way. And now it was time for that voice to stand on its own. 5 minutes, Charlie announced. "I'll go introduce you." As Charlie left, Artie took a deep breath, centering himself. Jacob picked up his camera, raised it to eye level, then lowered it again. "May I?" he asked, gesturing with the camera. Artie nodded, understanding. This moment, the quiet before the public transformation, deserved to be preserved. Jacob filmed silently as Artie gathered himself, straightened his shoulders, and opened the copy of Cardboard Confessions he would read from. The camera captured the delicate balance of vulnerability and determination in his expression, the hands that had once held cardboard now cradling a published book bearing his name. In the main room, Charlie addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce a poet whose journey has captivated millions but whose words would matter even without that attention. A voice of uncommon honesty and surprising grace. Please welcome Arthur Sinclair." The applause swelled as Artie stepped through the doorway. He moved toward the podium with measured steps, his gaze immediately finding Vanessa in the front row. She smiled at him. A real smile, not the guarded expression he'd grown accustomed to in their recent meetings. Behind her sat Linda from the diner, who had provided him free coffee on many cold mornings. Several former street acquaintances occupied chairs near the back, looking almost as uncomfortable in the bookstore as Artie felt at the podium. The homeless community had shown up to support one of their own, crossing the invisible boundary that usually separated their world from literary gatherings like this. And beside them, to Artie's shock, stood Morgan Freeman. Their eyes met across the room, and Morgan gave a subtle nod of encouragement. He'd made it back after all, slipping in quietly to witness this culmination of their shared journey. The sight of all these people, his daughter, Morgan, those who had known him at his lowest, and those now discovering his work, gave Artie a sudden clarity. The disparate pieces of his life, once so painfully fragmented, had begun to reconnect. Not seamlessly, not without scars, but with a new integrity that acknowledged both the brokenness and the healing. He adjusted the microphone and opened his book to the first page. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear. "Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Arthur Sinclair, and these poems were written on cardboard while I lived on the streets of New York City. They weren't meant for publication or performance. They were a way of remembering who I was, even when I'd lost everything else." He paused, gathering himself. "The first poem is called Invisible. I wrote it during my third winter without a home." Artie began to read. His poet's voice, once silenced by shame and circumstance, filled the room. The words that had once been scrawled on discarded cardboard now resonated with renewed power, bridging worlds that rarely intersected, revealing truth that transcended both privilege and poverty. In that moment of transformation, Arthur Sinclair was neither the disgraced professor nor the homeless poet, but simply a man whose voice had finally found its way home. After the reading, as Artie signed books for a line that stretched to the door, Vanessa approached the table. She waited patiently until the current admirer moved on, then stepped forward. "That was beautiful, Dad," she said softly. "Mom would have been proud." Artie swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Thank you for coming. It means more than I can say." Vanessa hesitated, then reached into her bag. "I brought something for you." She placed a worn book on the table, his second collection, Beneath Still Waters. "Your mother's copy," Artie recognized, touching it gently. Vanessa nodded. "She used to read it after you were gone. I'd find her with it late at night." She pushed it toward him. "Would you sign it? For both of us?" Artie picked up his pen, Morgan's gift, and opened to the title page. For a long moment he sat motionless, overwhelmed by the weight of the gesture. Then, with careful deliberation, he wrote, "For Vanessa and Beth." The words were always, "For you, even when I lost my way. With love that never truly left. Arthur, Dad." He closed the book and returned it to her, their fingers brushing in the exchange. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. It wasn't the resurrection of the family they'd once been, but it was acknowledgement, connection, possibility. "Coffee on Sunday?" Vanessa asked, the invitation becoming part of their new ritual. "I'd like that," Artie replied. As Vanessa moved away, Morgan approached the signing table. He placed a copy of Cardboard Confessions before Artie. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "A remarkable achievement." "You came back," Artie observed, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I rearranged some things," Morgan replied with a smile. "Some moments shouldn't be missed." Artie signed the book with a personal note of gratitude, then looked up at the man whose Chance encounter had changed everything. What happens now, he asked, the question encompassing more than just the book's reception. Morgan considered this thoughtfully. Now you continue writing, continue rebuilding with your daughter, continue using your voice for those who remain unheard. His expression softened. And perhaps when you're ready, you help others find their voices too. The suggestion resonated with something Artie had been considering, a workshop for people experiencing homelessness, a space where their stories could emerge through poetry, prose, or whatever form suited their truth. I might need some advice. Along the way, Artie said. Morgan smiled. That's what friends are for. As the event wound down, Charlie approached with news of early sales figures and media interest. Jacob documented final moments for his film. Bookstore staff began the process of closing up, though many lingered to speak with the poet whose journey had touched them. Through it all, Artie remained present, engaged, no longer hiding from connection or recognition. The transformation wasn't complete, such journeys never truly are, but the direction was clear. From invisibility toward presence, from shame toward purpose, from isolation toward community. Outside the bookstore, the New York evening pulsed with its usual energy. Somewhere in the city, others sat writing on cardboard, their voices yet to be discovered. For now, at least one of them had found his way back from the margins, carrying with him the hard-earned wisdom that might illuminate the path for others. And in that possibility, that ripple effect of one voice inspiring another, lay perhaps the most meaningful transformation of all. 6 months later, the autumn wind scattered leaves across Washington Square Park, where students and tourists mingled in the late afternoon light. Among them walked Arthur Sinclair, no longer the disheveled figure who had once haunted these streets, but not quite the polished professor of years past either. He'd found a middle ground, neat but casual clothing, his gray hair trimmed but still somewhat untamed, his posture straight but approachable. He checked his watch and quickened his pace. The screening began in 30 minutes, and he'd promised Vanessa he wouldn't be late. After years of absence, punctuality had become a quiet way of rebuilding trust between them, a silent affirmation that her time mattered to him. Professor Sinclair. Artie turned to see a young woman approaching, a copy of Cardboard Confessions clutched to her chest. The title, Professor, still felt strange, an echo from a previous life that occasionally resurfaced in unexpected moments. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, slightly breathless. I'm in the MFA program at Columbia. Your book, it changed how I think about poetry. These encounters still surprised him, readers finding him in the most ordinary places, eager to share how his words had affected them. In the months since its publication, Cardboard Confessions had developed a passionate following, particularly among young writers searching for authenticity in an increasingly performative world. That's very kind, Artie replied, genuine but aware of the time. I'm afraid I'm running late for an appointment. Of course, could you just sign it quickly? It would mean so much. Artie nodded, taking the book and pen she offered. Your name? Eliza. He signed with a brief note of encouragement and returned the book. Keep writing, Eliza. From anywhere, on anything. The material doesn't matter, only the truth beneath it. Her smile of gratitude followed him as he continued across the park, adjusting his course toward the small theater where Jacob's documentary would have its first public screening. After months of editing and festival submissions, the poet's voice was finally ready to share with the world. The world. The concept still unsettled Artie. For years, his world had shrunk to the size of a cardboard sheet, his audience limited to disinterested passers-by. Now his words had traveled far beyond New York City, reaching readers across continents. The documentary would extend that reach even further. As he approached the theater, Artie spotted Vanessa waiting outside. Their weekly coffees had gradually expanded to include dinners, museum visits, and now this. His daughter willingly standing beside him as Jacob's film prepared to expose their painful history to public view. Right on time, she noted with approval, kissing his cheek. "I promised," he replied simply. Inside the theater lobby, familiar faces greeted them. Charlie, beaming with satisfaction at the success of Cardboard Confessions, which had exceeded even his optimistic projections. Jacob, simultaneously nervous and excited about the screening, camera conspicuously absent for once. Linda from the diner, who had become an unexpected friend, bringing homemade cookies to each of Artie's local readings, and in the center of it all stood Morgan Freeman, who had flown in specifically for this event. His friendship with Artie had deepened in the months since their chance encounter, moving beyond catalyst and subject to a genuine connection based on mutual respect. "The man of the hour," Morgan said warmly, embracing Artie. "How are you feeling about this?" "Exposed," Artie admitted. "But I suppose that's the point." Morgan nodded, understanding. "Jacob's done something special with your story. It's honest without being exploitative, powerful without being sentimental." "That's what worries me," Artie said, lowering his voice. "The honesty. Vanessa has never seen the full extent of where I was, what I became." Morgan glanced toward Vanessa, who was engaged in conversation with Jacob across the lobby. "She's made her peace with it, Artie. She's here by choice." "Still," Artie murmured, "there's knowing, and then there's seeing." Before Morgan could respond, Jacob called for everyone's attention, announcing that the screening would begin in 5 minutes. The small crowd, a carefully curated mixture of critics, friends, and figures from Artie's journey, began moving toward the theater doors. Artie felt Vanessa's hand slip into his. "Together?" she asked simply. He squeezed her hand in response, grateful beyond words for her presence. The documentary opened with the viral moment that had started everything. Morgan Freeman kneeling beside a homeless man, reading poetry from a piece of cardboard. But it quickly expanded outward, weaving together the threads of Artie's past and present. His rise as a respected poet and professor, the devastating loss of his wife, his descent into alcoholism and homelessness, and his unexpected second chance. Jacob had skillfully balanced the narrative, neither romanticizing Artie's time on the streets nor dwelling excessively on his darkest moments. It was an honest portrait of fall and redemption, a voice lost and found again. What caught Artie by surprise was how much of the film focused not just on his journey, but on its impact. There were interviews with people who had been moved by his story, some inspired to reconnect with estranged family members, others motivated to look differently at the homeless individuals they passed each day. The ripple effects extended further than he had imagined. Most powerful were the scenes documenting his reconciliation with Vanessa. Jacob had captured their cautious early meetings, the painful visit to Beth's grave, and the gradual rebuilding of trust between them. Beside him in the darkened theater, Vanessa squeezed his hand during these moments, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd come. The film concluded with Artie reading at the book launch, his voice steady and clear as he shared the words that had once been hidden on cardboard. The camera panned across the diverse faces in the audience, literary figures alongside people from the streets, his daughter alongside strangers touched by his poetry. As the screen faded to black, a final quote appeared. "To the voices lost, but never gone." The dedication from his book now serving as the documentary's closing thought. When the lights came up, Artie was surprised to find tears on his cheeks. Seeing his journey through Jacob's lens had provided a perspective he'd lacked, the ability to witness his own transformation as others had experienced it. The applause was warm and sustained. Jacob was called to the front for a brief Q&A, joined by Artie and Morgan at the audience's insistence. As they discussed the making of the film, Artie found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful evening when Morgan had stopped to read his poetry. "Mr. Sinclair," a critic asked, "how has your writing changed since you've returned to more conventional circumstances?" Artie considered the question thoughtfully. "The circumstances have changed, but the essential truth hasn't. I still write. From the same place. That intersection of experience and observation, loss and resilience. The difference is that now, I no longer write to make sense of my isolation. I write to build bridges across it. As the Q&A concluded, Jacob shared news that several major streaming services were interested in the documentary, ensuring it would reach a global audience. The announcement was met with enthusiasm, though Artie received it with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. His words, once written for himself alone, would now travel to places he would never see, touching lives he would never know. After the screening, a small reception was held in the theater's atrium. As guests mingled over wine and appetizers, Morgan drew Artie aside to a quiet corner. "I have something for you," he said, presenting Artie with a small wrapped package. Artie opened it to find a beautiful leather-bound journal. Inside, on the first page, Morgan had written, "For the next chapter of your journey, may it be filled with truth, grace, and the courage to keep speaking." "Thank you," Artie said, genuinely moved by the gift. "Though I'm not sure what that next chapter looks like yet." Morgan smiled. "It's already taking shape, whether you recognize it or not." He nodded toward the reception, where Vanessa was speaking animatedly with Charlie and Jacob. Beyond them, in a more unexpected grouping, Linda from the diner was deep in conversation with two literary critics and one of Artie's former street acquaintances, worlds colliding in ways that would have seemed impossible months ago. "You've created this," Morgan observed. "Not just the book or the film, but these connections, these bridges between lives that might never have intersected otherwise." Artie watched the scene thoughtfully. "I never intended any of this. I was just trying to survive." "The most powerful stories often begin that way," Morgan replied, "with someone simply trying to endure, to make sense of their experience, to find meaning in difficulty." He placed a hand on Artie's shoulder. "The legacy of your journey isn't just your poetry, Artie. It's the reminder that every person has a voice worth hearing, especially those we've trained ourselves not to see." Before Artie could respond, Jacob approached with news that a prominent arts foundation wanted to discuss funding for Artie's emerging project, workshops for homeless writers, providing both creative outlet and potential path toward visibility. "They were deeply moved by the documentary," Jacob explained. "They want to help expand what you're doing at the shelter into something larger, more sustainable." The workshop had begun as a humble initiative, Artie visiting a local shelter once a week, working with residents interested in expressing themselves through writing. It had started small with just 3 participants, but had grown steadily as word spread. The idea that it might now expand, reaching more people in need of voice and visibility, filled Artie with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "That's wonderful news," Morgan said. "Exactly what we were just discussing, the ripples continuing outward." As Jacob shared more details about the foundation's interest, Vanessa joined them, slipping her arm through her father's with a casual intimacy that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "Dad, Charlie says they're considering a second printing already. The first is nearly sold out." The pride in her voice warmed Artie more than the sales figures. That she could speak of his success with such genuine pleasure, after all the pain he had caused her, felt like the greatest achievement of all. "We should celebrate," Jacob suggested. "All of us together." Morgan checked his watch. "I have an early flight tomorrow, but I could manage a quick dinner." Plans quickly took shape, with Charlie making calls to secure a private room at a nearby restaurant. As the group prepared to depart, Artie found himself momentarily alone, watching the various threads of his life intertwine in this unexpected tapestry. Vanessa approached, concern flickering across her features as she noted his pensive expression. "Everything okay?" Artie nodded, just taking it all in. "Sometimes it's hard to believe this is my life now." She studied him for a moment. "You know, I used to think forgiveness was something you gave to someone else, a gift, or maybe a concession." She looked toward the others, now gathering by the exit. "But I'm learning it's also something you give yourself. Permission to move forward, to accept joy again, to believe in second chances." Her words resonated deeply with Artie, who had struggled with accepting his own redemption, always feeling somewhat unworthy of the opportunities that had come his way. Your mother would be proud of you, he said softly. The woman you've become. She'd be proud of both of us, Vanessa replied, for finding our way back to each other. Dinner was a joyous affair, filled with good food, easy conversation, and occasional bursts of laughter. Artie found himself surrounded by a makeshift family. Not the one he had lost, but a new configuration of meaningful connections that had emerged from the wreckage of his former life. As the evening wound down, Morgan raised his glass in a toast. To Artie, he began, his resonant voice drawing the table to attention, whose words reminded us that true poetry doesn't require perfect circumstances, only an honest heart and the courage to speak its truth. Glasses clinked, and Artie accepted, the toast with humble gratitude. But as the conversation resumed around him, he found himself reflecting on Morgan's words from earlier, about legacy, about ripples extending outward, about bridges between worlds. His gaze settled on Jacob, whose documentary would soon reach audiences far beyond this intimate gathering. The young filmmaker had transformed from opportunistic videographer to committed storyteller, his own artistic voice maturing through the process of documenting Artie's journey. Then to Charlie, the publisher who had seen value in words written on cardboard, who had believed in second acts when most of the industry had forgotten Artie entirely. To Linda and the others who had known him at his lowest, who had offered small kindnesses that loomed large in retrospect, a free coffee, a sheltered doorway during rain, the dignity of being addressed by name when names were all he had left. And finally to Vanessa, his daughter, who had found the strength to move beyond justified anger toward the harder, braver work of reconciliation. In her, Artie saw echoes of Beth, the same resilience, the same capacity for forgiveness, the same unflinching honesty. As the evening concluded and the group dispersed into the cool night air, Artie and Vanessa found themselves walking together toward the subway. The city pulsed around them, a constant reminder of both his years of invisibility and his current unexpected visibility. Jacob asked if I'd consider writing a book about my experience, Vanessa said suddenly. A companion piece to the documentary, from my perspective. Artie glanced at her, surprised. What did you tell him? That I'd think about it. She hesitated. There's a part of me that wants to share it. What it was like to lose you. To wonder if you were dead or alive. To rediscover you through that viral video. But another part feels protective of our story. Like maybe it belongs just to us. Artie nodded, understanding. It's a delicate balance. Some stories need to be shared. Others are meant to remain private. What do you think I should do? I think, Artie said carefully, that you should listen to your own voice. Trust it to tell you which path feels right. Vanessa smiled at the answer. You sound like a professor again. Old habits, he admitted with a small shrug. Though these days I'm learning as much as I'm teaching. They reached the subway entrance where they would head in separate directions, Vanessa to her apartment in Brooklyn, Artie to his modest studio near Columbia, where he had recently begun teaching a single evening class in creative writing. Sunday brunch? Vanessa asked, their weekly tradition now firmly established. Wouldn't miss it, Artie promised. Though I'll be coming straight from the shelter workshop. They embraced, a gesture that had grown more natural with each passing month. As Vanessa descended the subway stairs, Artie called after her. Vanessa? She turned back. Your voice matters too, he said simply. Whatever you decide to do with it. Her smile, so reminiscent of her mother's, remained with him as he turned toward home, walking streets that had once been his reluctant shelter and were now simply his neighborhood again. 3 weeks later, Morgan Freeman sat in his home theater, a glass of scotch in hand, watching the final cut of The Poet's Voice on the evening of its streaming release. Though he had seen it at the screening, he wanted to experience it again, in solitude, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a chance encounter on a New York sidewalk. His phone buzzed with a text from Artie. It's officially live. Still feels surreal? Morgan smiled, typing back. The best stories often do. How are you feeling? The response came quickly. Grateful for everything. especially that you stopped to read those words. As the documentary played, Morgan reflected on the nature of storytelling, how some stories find us when we least expect them, demanding to be told. His career had been built on giving voice to characters created by others, but in Artie's case, he had simply amplified a voice already present, waiting to be heard. The final scenes showed Artie leading a workshop at the shelter, surrounded by people finding their own voices through writing. The camera lingered on their faces, intent, engaged, alive with the possibility that their words too might matter to someone somewhere. Over these images, Artie's voice delivered the film's closing reflection. We write to remember who we are when circumstances conspire to make us forget. We write to make sense of what seems senseless. We write to build bridges across the chasms that separate us, from each other, from our past selves, from the world that moves so quickly, it fails to notice those left behind. I wrote on cardboard because it was what I had, but the material never mattered, only the truth inscribed upon it. Only the voice that refused to be silenced even when it believed no one was listening. Perhaps that's the greatest legacy any of us can leave. Not monuments or achievements, but the courage to speak our truth, especially when it emerges from places of loss or failure or invisibility. For in those unvarnished words, others may find permission to voice their own. And in that exchange, that bridge between one human experience and another, we find what we most deeply seek: the assurance that we are not alone, that our story continues beyond the page, and that even in our darkest moments our voice matters. As the credits began to roll, Morgan raised his glass in a solitary toast, not just to Artie but to all those whose voices waited to be discovered, whose stories lingered at the edges of visibility, whose words might yet build bridges across the divides that seemed so insurmountable. Somewhere in New York City, a man who had once been homeless was now helping others find their voice. A book of poetry written on cardboard was being read in living rooms and classrooms across the country. A daughter and father were rebuilding what had been broken, and countless viewers of Jacob's documentary were looking with new eyes at the people they passed on the street each day. The ripples continued outward, touching lives in ways that could never be fully measured or known. And in that unseen impact lay the true legacy of the poet's voice, not fame or acclaim, but the quiet reminder that every life contains a story worth telling. Every voice deserves to be heard, and sometimes, the most profound transformations begin with the simple act of stopping to listen. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.